Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Ms. Tish Long, Chair of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance Board of Directors.
Good morning, and welcome to day 2 of the Intelligence and National Security Summit. Hopefully I'm saying welcome back to a number of you. I hope everyone enjoyed yesterday's program, as well as both networking receptions that took place yesterday afternoon. So year after year, the senior-most leaders in our community see this summit as the forum to share strategic insights with their most crucial partners. And I would say this year is no exception. I think we had some amazing conversations yesterday, hearing from NCTC Director Abizaid to kick us off, of course, Deputy Secretary Hicks, and a panel of military agency leaders few other organizations could assemble. I'd like to, just a big shout out to both the INSA and AFCEA staffs, just doing a tremendous job putting this together. And of course, this morning is no exception, which is why everyone's here so bright and early. We have a terrific opening session focused on the Russia-Ukraine conflict and its impact on U.S. national security. Of course, we touched on the conflict yesterday in almost every discussion. We're going to hear from 2 really highly renowned experts today. As a reminder, we do value your questions, in particular early submissions of the questions to the email questions@intelsummit.org. Later today, you will receive an event survey at your registration email address. We really value your feedback. Please be candid. We do take it into account as we are planning the summit. We are already planning next year's summit. So your input will really help guide our decisions as we put together the 2023 program. Again, I'd like to thank our sponsors and encourage all of you to take advantage of the opportunities to interact with our exhibitors today. I got to a number of the booths yesterday, and it's pretty impressive, some of the work that's going on, particularly by some of the smaller startups. So if you haven't made it to the exhibits, I really encourage you to do that. It's worth your time. A couple logistical points. At the conclusion of this morning's plenary, we'll have a 30-minute networking break, followed by breakout sessions focused on election security, a continuing topic, as well as technology futures. And then we'll conclude the summit, as we have been doing in years past, with our blockbuster strategic intelligence plenary session. And we've got the agency directors or deputy directors from the Big Six: CIA, DIA, FBI, NGA, NRO, and NSA. Now, yesterday, I spoke about partnerships and the importance of the strong relationship we have with AFCEA. And that, enables our organizations to put on this event as really a top event year after year. Yesterday, we welcomed AFCEA President and CEO, Lieutenant General Retired Susan Lawrence, to her first summit. And Susan, there's a number of Intel officers in this room, myself included. I received some very timely intelligence that today is a special day for you. So not only is Susan here doing her first summit, it's her birthday. She's gonna kill me for telling you. But happy birthday, Susan, and please wish her many happy returns as you bump into her throughout the day. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. Yeah, I know, you'll get me back. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Rear Admiral Ray Spicer, U.S. Navy retired, who is the Vice President for Defense and Intelligence at IBM Federal. And Ray will introduce our moderator for this morning's opening plenary. So please give Ray a warm welcome.
From pandemics to conflicts and cyber attacks, the threat landscape is changing quickly, as is the sophistication and severity behind the conflicts that defense and intelligence organizations face. This is a digital world, and government agencies need to analyze enormous quantities of data to inform their actions. But to pursue an advantage over advanced threats, you need a modern approach. Enter IBM Open Hybrid Multi-Cloud, designed to help defense and intelligence agencies protect and leverage data to its full potential and provide the flexibility, agility, and consistency needed for your journey to the cloud. IBM Open Hybrid Multi-Cloud helps empower you to make the most informed decisions possible, enabling agencies to analyze data and provide insights in near real time. It's security forward, with advanced technologies like confidential computing to protect your data while it's in use, and edge computing, designed to help you gain rapid access and insights by reducing latency and response time. You get access to your legacy and current data, even if siloed, and become more efficient by securely moving workloads to the data. The Open Hybrid Multi-Cloud environment is also designed to orchestrate across IT operations, deploy while existing systems are in use, and manage across operations through a single control. You can't predict the future or know what the next threat will be, but you can prepare for it by creating a resilient, agile, and secured advantage in the modern digital world. IBM Open Hybrid Multi-Cloud for the defense and intelligence community.
Good morning. I guess I don't have to push IBM when I do my introduction now. I had no idea that video was going to be up there. But thanks, Tish, for the kind introduction. I cannot think of a topic more at the forefront of the world events today than Russia-Ukraine. So we're going to get right to it. But first, I'd like to thank INSA and AFCEA for their support, for putting on this event, and for their leadership in the community. IBM is certainly proud and honored to have been a longstanding partner of AFCEA, INSA, and the intelligence community for many years. And it's a tremendous privilege to be associated and working alongside so many dedicated professionals across government, the military, academia, industry, and beyond. Among those dedicated professionals is this panel's moderator, who I have the pleasure of introducing. Julian Barnes is the national security reporter for the New York Times, covering U.S. intelligence agencies. He has reported on national security for many years, although he doesn't look that old, over 20 years, working for U.S. News and World Report, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, and then returning to the New York Times in 2018. He began covering the military while working for U.S. News and World Report and was embedded with the 101st Airborne Division during the invasion of Iraq. In recent months, Julian has done some fabulous reporting and coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, so it promises to be a very exciting panel. Please welcome Julian, who will introduce the members of the panel and enjoy the panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that introduction. Let me introduce our panel here. We have Dr. Evelyn Farkas, who is the executive director of the McCain Institute, but who I met when she was the Pentagon DASD, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Ukraine and Russia, at a pretty critical time as well. And we have retired Brigadier General Peter Zwack, who is with the Woodrow Wilson Center, but crucially in his career was the defense attaché in Moscow from 2012 to 2014, also a crucial period and one we're going to draw upon here in this conversation. But we want to start today with, kind of the news that's dominated the last week or so, which is the Ukrainian counteroffensive. We have a few maps that Jane's, the defense intelligence firm, has put up for us. So when we get a chance, let's throw up, there we go. And so this is our overview, and we can see it here, you guys can see it there. And I wanted to start just by asking you, General, what you thought about the importance of this, this campaign.
Julian, thank you. Evelyn, great to be with you again. Friends, ladies and gentlemen, an honor. When we look at the context of really the remarkable prior 10 days, I ask, first of all, think about where we were almost 7 months ago. And when we saw this looming cloud and all this discussion back and forth on the Russian buildup, are they going to go or are they not? But they did go, and they got to Kyiv within miles. And we all know the story. And then they melted down and were thrown out by much fiercer than anticipated Ukrainian resistance. Now, that was the extraordinary victory. Well, here we are, 5 months after the fact, and Ukrainian forces, certainly supplemented by U.S. and ally partner weapons and training and leadership and small unit tactics, but more importantly, they've got moxie. They're fighting on their home terrain. They're fighting as the Soviets fought exactly on this ground against the Nazis, except now the Soviets or the Russians or the Nazis. So it is what's going on in the pushing back of Russian forces that literally, as they did outside Kyiv, seemingly hit a breaking point and started to melt down. And that's what happens. Winning, success is contagious, and so is failure and defeat. And that is what we're seeing is this contagion that routed, if you will, caught the Russian forces. They're going to try to get their feet under them on the Oskil River and in the Donetsk. But this is huge because there are, in my mind, two major existential fights going on, and then a supra. One, the existence of Ukraine as a free-minded, sovereign state. And while I don't like to use the word guaranteed, it looks like there will be a Ukraine in the future that is not under complete Russian dominance. The problem is what will it look like? And I think the Kharkiv offensive is shaping that, and then the all-important South. The second existential fight, and it's just beginning, it's been out there, is what's going on in the Kremlin and the regime of Vladimir Putin. And I believe that's an existential fight for him and his inner circle, and that this could mutate into that while there were already tremors coming up from Kyiv. And then there is the third existential Sopra fight where, and this is where you've got Europe, us, it's the overall Ukraine being, if you will, the centerpiece here at great sacrifice. This is a fight of fundamental, a free-minded nation and a bunch of free-minded nations supporting it against rising autocracy, authoritarianism, and the edge of totalitarianism world, which is what makes this all so important. So no, this is a big deal, and Julian, I really appreciated your articles about this, and Evelyn, I look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Let's go to the third map here, which shows, there you go. And so this is in some ways, the surprise counteroffensive, the one the Russians did not see coming. We know now that the US, Britain provided intelligence about where the Russians were weak that the Ukrainians used to sort of make a new plan to go here, which, as we can see, pushed far faster, far more territory than expected. Dr. Farkas, Could you talk a little bit about what you see as the significance of this and the significance of the U.S. role here?
Yeah. So, Julian, first of all, thank you very much for moderating and bringing your expertise and your experience to this. We know we can't duck your good questions. Thank you to INSA for inviting me and holding this. Thank you to the sponsors of this conference, my good friend Larry Hanauer, a fellow civil servant as well from the Hill days. Look, it's undeniable that the Ukrainians could not have done this without the help of the United States and our allies. That's because we've been providing them, obviously, with military equipment of increasing capability over time. We have been training them since 2014. Let's not forget, this is not a new war. And we've been training them at all different echelons, different types of forces, to include special operations forces. I think that's very important. We've trained them in irregular warfare. We've trained them in disinformation, two things that were very much in use here, because the Ukrainians conducted their offensive by signaling that they were going to conduct an offensive in the south, and then they went east. But they also were continuing their operations in the south, so it wasn't as if...
They were real operations. It wasn't a pure feint.
Yes, exactly. And apparently, I'm now reading, I don't have this inside information, but you good journalists are ferreting out the fact that our intelligence included giving information to the Ukrainians about where the Russian forces were weak and vulnerable. So they were able to essentially force the Russians to make a bunch of decisions that compounded bad decisions they've already made all along. So the equipment, the intelligence we're providing, the training all along, the real-time, I think, advisory capability that we have has all contributed. And then there's really the huge intangible thing which Russia does not have, which is the will of the Ukrainian fighters. And many of these are just regular people. Of course, they have trained armed forces as well, but they're training new people every day to fight. All the men are required to stay within Ukraine and fight. And so, and they're motivated to defend their territory and their way of life, which of course is not the case on the Russian side of the equation.
Let me pick up on that a little bit, because let's go, this war has had a lot of intelligence successes. But one thing that the U.S. intelligence community does not seem to have been correct about was definitely the Russian military strength, its ability to take Kyiv, and there's debate, but certainly members of Congress have said the intelligence community got the Ukrainian will to fight wrong. I wanted to ask you both what you thought. Was there a misassessment of Russian military might? Was there a misreading of the Ukrainians? And are we getting better now?
I think that most of us would have said that we thought that the Russian military was certainly better than it has displayed. Not 10 feet tall. We always said that they look at us as 10 feet tall. But what is inescapable, and I've been to a number of Russian exercises, as some of you, the big ones, whether it was Zapad or Vostok, they were big, stage-managed, choreographed exercises. A lot of noise and thunder and lightning and firepower demonstrations, but they didn't focus on what we could call frontal operations.
Did we know that at the time? Where if you were observing it, or the Americans were collecting intelligence on it, did they knew that these were stage managed, as you say?
Oh yeah, I think that aspect we knew, and they did exercise their logistics. They brought troops in from the central and eastern military districts to the Zapad Western exercises, but the actual operational side of supporting a large force on the offense for hundreds of kilometers, and the logistics and the trucks, they did not exercise heavily. They got stuff, they moved stuff all over the place, but for long, sustained, aggressive fight on hostile, occupied terrain, Yeah, they have their, the Rosgvardia and their troops that fill in the partisan fight. But no, they did not prepare for this. They thought it would. There was an arrogance and disdain in a lot of our mind that whether the number was 150, 180,000, 200,000, it wasn't enough because they had dismally miscalculated the will and moxie of the Ukrainians. And oh my God, that first week, the Ukrainians grew a leader. When Zelensky said, stop, basically, no, I'm not leaving Kyiv. Russia, back off. And all of a sudden, Ukrainians who were going to fight now had a leader. And that leadership, and many of you would know, filtered down through the ranks and gave them even more motivation. The Russians underestimated that. We probably underestimated that because going into conflict, there were issues, if you will, in the Ukrainian senior political scene on how this would go, and even disagreement about what the Russians would do.
Dr. Farkas, will you react to that? And this seems to be something the United States has a hard time doing, which is assessing our partners' will to fight, ability to fight. We get it wrong almost every conflict, one way or the other, it seems.
Well, I think, okay, so first of all, I have to caveat everything I'm saying with I haven't read intelligence in the run-up to this phase of the war. I've been out of government, and so I can't say with certainty that our government didn't know that the Russians had problems with logistics, that they were overselling their military modernization. I can't say with certainty that our intelligence community underestimated the Ukrainian capabilities. But what I can say is, having been in government and watching from the outside, it appears that we all underestimated, first of all, the Ukrainian capability, the training and the will and the political will, and I think the general is absolutely correct, that the critical component in all of this was that the political leadership, starting with the president, said, I'm not leaving, I am fighting to the death, and his people went along with him. And the undertone or the hidden question under there is, or the comparison could be made with Afghanistan, I think you're saying, because that's another case where, or maybe I shouldn't put those words in your mouth.
No, that's what I was
that was
totally
what I
going
thought
for.
You were thinking, yeah. And in the case of Afghanistan, we also underestimated the capabilities of the Afghan forces, the will of the Afghan people, the will of the Afghan government. So this is another instance where we underestimated it. We did understand that there was more will to defend their government and their territory than there was will in Russia to conduct this war. However, we thought that Putin's will might overcome the will of the what we thought were the weaker Ukrainians. I do think that it's important, though, to understand that we kind of bought the Russian story on their modernization.
Yeah.
So I don't know how to account for that, because on the one hand, there's the will of the Russian soldiers, and that's very hard to measure, especially as you know, we had great, capable analysts in there, including the general in Russia for all these years, but they don't have the access that you would have with friendly countries. So it's difficult to measure exactly what's happening in the military. And then again, the Russians really put on a great show for us. So we were caught flat-footed.
So what the intelligence community did very differently and very well, and has continued to do through this conflict, is declassify critical pieces of information about Russian plans. Now, you both were in government in 2014 when when the government was a lot less quick about calling out what Russia has done. So, Dr. Farkas, if you could start a little bit about your analysis of the effectiveness of these declassifications, the difficulty of getting a government bureaucracy to want to do this, and the kind of historical context here.
Well, here's where you can actually feel excited about government, and I'm sure there are a lot of civil servants and former civil servants and government officials, political or non-political, in the audience. Here's where you can feel good about government and individuals who really care about national security learning. Because in the Obama administration, I sat in the White House Situation Room with my colleagues many of whom are now in the White House Situation Room again, facing many of the similar questions having to do with the war in Ukraine that Russia's waging against Ukraine and the world. And we talked about the need to share intelligence with our NATO allies, with the American public, with the world, with the Ukrainians, and struggled, how could we do it? And we were really kind of tied up and hampering our own efforts. And the biggest lesson learned, I think, for my former colleagues who are now in the Biden administration is we need to be more open, more transparent, because we get ahead of the game in terms of the public diplomacy, in terms of explaining to the world what is going on, and then also giving the Ukrainians and our allies an edge in terms of fighting the Russians. So across the board, not just when it comes to military moves, so we were very early on telegraphing the fact that the Russians were on the border, the fact that the Russians intended to invade. I believed all of that. I believed it was credible. Of course, not everyone believed our intelligence community now. Hopefully, they're more likely to. But all of that was telegraphed in advance. But there also, all along, have been political messages. The most recent one we saw was, I believe it was the State Department or someone in the government recently put out information explaining how much the Russians had spent targeting our society.
Can I quickly stop you there? Because we had an audience question just on that declassification from this week, which is how effective has that $300 million that the Russians have fed to international political parties been? I mean, is this...
Probably hugely effective. I mean, we see they have an ally within NATO in Viktor Orban. They have consistently over the years worked to weaken European unity, especially on getting diversity in the energy sector. They have targeted, of course, the Germans specifically. The major German party by hiring their former chancellor to serve on the board of their energy company. The list is long in terms of what the Russians have done. What they've done here, we know, 2016, read the Mueller report, and it never ended. I mean, it's ongoing. Microsoft put out a very good report about a couple of months ago. If you want to see what they've detected in terms of Russian disinformation, clearly they're spending money on that as well.
And that Microsoft report maps the sort of rise of propaganda in the individual country and then protests in those countries. General, I want you to just weigh in on both of these, about both on the kind of Russian influence campaigns around the world, but also if you could talk a little bit about this intelligence and how hard it is for the U.S. government to put out something to kind of show what they know about whether it's Russian influence campaigns or a Russian attack plan.
On the first piece, on the disinformation, nobody knows the exact 300 million, the hitting our allies, us, if you will, in our soft side, and the disinformation and subversion. What they have done in the last 6 months is completely undermined that effort. Everybody now is paying attention to it. Doesn't mean it's not happening, but it was even more dangerous pre-war, pre-Ukrainian invasion. But now everybody is aware. There are going to be nations, the nations that were more in line to that thinking are now themselves in the spotlight. And I think that the Russian subversion campaign and all that goes with it has been somewhat blunted because of the egregious and monstrosity of this invasion that has done a lot to pull the West and free-minded nations together to include addressing this threat, and it is, of course, still there. The second part of your question, refresh my memory.
Well, just on the declassification and how hard that is to do, and where maybe the line should be. Huge. As an observer, and many of us out there had worked with allies in the field through
NICs, and then through embassies, and then direct liaison with allies and partners. And as you know, it is a careful game. There are different levels of release. You've got your Five Eyes Plus, and then you have nations that you worry, well, we're on their side, have a history of being riddled by foreign intelligence, and certainly in the old East Bloc and Ukraine and Russia, which has been heavily worked on. Ukrainians have been very diligent about working and cleaning up their own intelligence apparatus. So nation by nation, and this is not a U.S. only thing, this is an allied thing, it is work. Now, what was going on in January and February, December in U.S. and allied intelligence was fantastic in my mind, and I was not on the inside. But what was done is a sense that the Russians were gearing up for something really bad and looking for a provokatsia, looking for a provocation. And you guys and the collective community with release and policy, every time anything remotely looked like a provocation, you and the policy centers inoculated our populations that if this comes and the Russians claim that this is an atrocity and it's BS. And so the Russians couldn't do the customary justification, disinformation to launch, which made their invasion in February even more unbelievable, and that now they have to go back to the same tropes that Evelyn and I saw back in 2014, fascism, militarism, and all of that. And that was in part because of the very careful release of information and intelligence, both to nations and also to the media.
So we had a little bit of a lull after a lot of information was coming out at before the invasion. We had a little bit of lull in these declassifications, but we have seen them again tick up. We've gotten information about Iranian drone purchases that were declassified. We've had declassified information about buying North Korea. That's the place to get your artillery these days. And is also manpower problems. Dr. Farkas, why do you think we're seeing now a little bit of a return to this playbook after a bit of a lull?
Well, I don't know why the lull, but clearly all of this contributes to helping shape the narrative about Russia's capabilities. And I should say, when I said we were caught flat-footed about Russia, that's too extreme. We've just miscalculated their abilities. We weren't caught flat-footed because we knew they were going to invade, and we knew that they would try what they were going to try. We just miscalculated the ability to achieve their objectives. So I think with regard to this disinformation, it's part of our effort to support the Ukrainian political military campaign, to explain to the world that Russia is not going to prevail in the long run, and so you ought to be putting your chips down on the winning side. And so there are multiple audiences, obviously, for this kind of information. For the Russians, to show the Russian government that we know what they're doing, for the Russian people who can get access to the truth. Obviously, your government is allied with North Korea and getting weapons from North Korea. You know, the Russians know what that means. Obviously, to our European allies, that's a very important audience because they're under incredible pressure right now as the winter's approaching, and they still rely heavily on Russian gas in particular. And then for the Ukrainian audience and the American audience. American audience for the administration is also important, and certainly Capitol Hill.
So I want to talk a little bit about the American provision of weapons and intelligence to the Ukrainians, and whether it is fast enough. The administration has been has been a little incremental about this. You know, they delayed the HIMARS and they brought the HIMARS in. At first, they weren't providing intelligence about Donbass and Crimea, and then they started providing intelligence about Donbass and Crimea. Has this incremental approach been wise, or should we have pushed more equipment faster, and should we step up the pace now? General.
I throw out, as a retired intelligence professional in all of this, I think in one point you go back on things. You are who you are when you were, all right? And we got to remember on the 24th of February, a pretty awful scenario was playing out. It looked like that the Russians were on a broad front. People had focused up and then primarily on the Donbass and around Crimea, on a broad front invasion of of Ukraine, that looked to be designed to decapitate the Ukrainian government and take the country or fully control it. Now, at that time, yes, we've been focusing on policy, and it is our policy. It's Europe, it's NATO, it's the world. What do we do? And I think justifiably, to a point, they had to be careful. But there was a spigot early on of the critical lower-level weapons that allowed the Ukrainians to win the tactical fights outside of Kyiv early on. Now, we can debate when we should have gone more heavy, more artillery earlier. Yes, in retrospect, but so much of this discussion is retrospect. The spigot increased. Europeans started to pour things in. I would say somewhere around month 2 or 3, I was all in on heavy armor and MiG-29s. The first few weeks, I was careful because we didn't know what we were dealing with. The Russians were brandishing, nuclear dialogue, and so all of that is going on. It's now it's healthy flow. And I do believe the Ukrainians need to be provided heavier weapons, including they fly, MiGs and heavier tanks. But again, I will go back to the beginning. I don't want to beat ourselves up. For February, early March, we were where we were when we were, and there was a good reaction. But we had to pull NATO together and our own selves to do it.
Dr. Farkas, should we beat ourselves up? Maybe we were too slow.
Well, look, when you're sitting in the White House, you have to make risk assessments. And so you have to look at your objective and consider how much risk you're willing to take. In this case, the objective is defeating Vladimir Putin so that he doesn't take over Ukraine and then take over Georgia, then take over Moldova, then make a probe vis-a-vis NATO, and then we're in a war with Russia. I mean, the stakes are super high here, right? So you have to think, how much risk are we willing to take in order to avoid World War III? And it's not an exaggeration to project out that if Vladimir Putin gets his way in Ukraine this year or next year, if he's still alive and in power, that he will turn to those other neighboring countries and, as I said, make the march and threaten NATO, which then means we're at war. So I would have thrown more heavier, more Western-style capable ammunition into the fight earlier. I would have trained the Ukrainians. It obviously took some initial steps. We probably should have tried even earlier in April. You remember the Russians were already lined up on the border. So you can forecast back and Monday morning quarterback and say we should have provided the Ukrainians with more Western equipment earlier. I think it took the war, this phase of the war, and the deliberate targeting of civilians, the human rights atrocities, actually what looks like a genocide on the Ukrainian people, being waged against the Ukrainian people, for us to make the calculation that we would give those Western-style weapons. But now what I do think is that we have a window of opportunity. The Ukrainian military has the momentum. The Russians are back on their heels. I worry that if we don't provide the Ukrainians with the weapons they need to push back further, get more territory, they will not be strong enough at the negotiating table, and the Russians may regroup if they have time. I do think in the long run they're not going to prevail, but I worry that the Ukrainians will get stuck again over the winter.
Well, is there a risk of the Ukrainians getting stuck? Is there a risk of the Ukrainians pushing too far, too fast, and getting and not having the troops to support that? General, what do you think? Is there a risk of them going too fast?
I agree with Evelyn that this is the time to support the Ukrainians with more and even more capable heavy weapons. Kharkiv there's sort of getting at your point, and I apologize for invoking a little bit of history, but in the spring of 1943, the Soviets had just taken Stalingrad, and they were pushing down into the German front and down towards Kharkiv, and Belgorod fell and all of that. And then the Germans, in their last successful big counteroffensive in the war, did the backhand blow. And the Soviets had overextended, and then the Germans hit them and pushed them back. It was only an operational victory in that the Soviets were moving again by that summer. And I think that the Ukrainians have to worry, and I think they do worry, about overextension. Remember, some of you, late 14, 15, Battle of Debaltseve in Donbass, where the Ukrainians were kind of in a heady mood. They were pushing on the Russian proxies, and then at a certain point, the Russians ordered in surreptitiously, never stated publicly, regulars, and shattered those Ukrainian formations in early 2015, and that led to the final 2014-2015 Minsk line. I think that the Ukrainians are aware. We're certainly advising, but getting at Evelyn's point, there is momentum here and initiative, and you've got to take advantage of it now. There's a chance to kick the whole rotten door down if they keep pressing, and they're now moving into the flank of northwest Donbass and setting the stage now for Russian reinforcements being redeployed from the south to the north, and then that gives them more. So there is that. Overextension, it's a big risk. But the Ukrainians have got more robustness and more reserves than I think a lot of people think. But this is the time. And I think we need to support realistically as much as we can. Last point, the Russians along the border are quite nervous. There was an article in, I think, today or yesterday's Times about Belgorod and Russians. I've been to Belgorod. It's a big Russian military staging area. I was there in 2014 for the first time. And the fact that they're nervous and everything else, this counteroffensive is now not just projecting success, if you will, in Ukraine, but it is projecting worry in Russia, which gets at the other strategic and existential struggle again on the Russian internals that I think we're still in the front end of.
Dr. Farkas, since the counteroffensive, there's been a little bit of shift in how some Russian officials have been talking and Russian media has been talking. A lot more, this is a NATO war, a lot more, this is U.S. weapons, this is U.S. intelligence. That was always present, but we see an uptick here. And there's a question from the audience about the risk of escalation by more stuff. Are we in a dangerous moment here when the Russians are talking about this war differently? A dangerous moment of triggering a wider war with NATO or the US?
Okay. We had the same moment back when people were talking about supplying MiGs to the Ukrainians. We had the same exact Lavrov coming out and saying, don't you dare because we'll hit Western targets or threatening.
Well, he didn't get
They
MiGs.
don't want war with NATO. I mean, to think that the Russians will actually fire on a NATO country or a NATO.
Article 5 is working, you're saying?
Article 5 is working. They can barely beat Ukraine. They don't want a war with NATO. So I think that's a lot of bluster to try to attack our will, our unity with our transatlantic and actually trans-Pacific allies. Attack our will to provide not just ongoing supply of ammunitions, but increased capable ammunitions. That's what the Russians see is working, and they want to try to erode that. So they'll try to do it rhetorically. But I don't believe, yes, there's a risk of escalation. That's why, of course, I mentioned, you have to think about what your objective is and how much risk you're willing to take. It is true that the Russians do this nuclear saber rattling all the time. But again, on that issue, I'm going to get ahead of a potential question here.
It's right here.
If
I was
Vladimir
about to
Putin
ask
were
it.
to use a nuclear weapon in a demonstration bomb, let's say even in like an uninhabited part of Siberia, right? A tactical nuclear explosion, and say, okay, next one's going to go off, I don't know where in Ukraine, if you guys don't stop supporting Ukraine. The response from the international community would be unmitigated horror that for the first time in anger since World War II, the Russian government detonated a nuclear device. The international community would rally. Now, our nuclear policy is mutual assured destruction. So because it's demonstration effect, it's not against the United States. It would be unclear whether we would retaliate with a nuclear weapon. I don't think President Biden would do such a thing. But what he would consider, together with a host of other nations and the international community, is whether this guy who could authorize such a thing should be in power anymore in Moscow. So I think it would spell the end of Vladimir Putin's regime one way or another.
I think we want to spin forward a little bit here to so the audience can have a sense of where we might go and how this might end. Two questions. The first one is, how dangerous is the winter and Russia's control over energy in Europe to Allied resolve? I'll start with you, General, but I also want to hear from you, Dr. Farkas.
The good news is that the winter has been heavily debated and discussed, and Europe and the world knows. I mean, Germany has, well, it's got its still major dependency issues on Russia and Eastern Europe especially, and fuel, natural gas and oil, but it is better. And I think that there's a side of the Russian behaviors being so just, black, and that I think that the Germans are tightening their belt. While ugly, we may get through it. Again, the media, everybody's talking about it. The Russians will certainly, look, Putin is desperate. This fails, he's done. And I think this is a major tool, a non-kinetic tool for him, including the whole grain game that they've been playing in the Black Sea. So yeah, I think it's very important, but it seems that the West, certainly Europe, and I was just in Europe for several weeks. Yes, a lot of people just make a deal, just make it end. But I think that, again, the behaviors have been so over the top that there'll be crisis moments, but Europe will hang together. One other point, when we talk about NATO, and Putin earned this. Who could have imagined 4 or 5 months ago that Finland and Sweden would want to be actively part of NATO, and how that's changed the messaging in the world, not just in Europe to Russia, but to the United Nations, and then this fence-sitting world that troubles us, that is kind of playing it both ways. That was huge. But getting at your point, the energy piece is huge, but I think people are paying attention. The offsets are being done. I think we're going to get through it. Who else is going to have a tough winter? Are the Russians.
Yeah. Dr. Farkas, I want you to react to that, but also maybe segue to your thoughts on how much territory does Ukraine need to reclaim to end this war? And I'm going to combine that question for me with the audience question, which is Crimea. Do you think Ukraine wants to reacquire Crimea? Will they attempt to reacquire Crimea? And what is the political implications of a Crimea offensive?
Okay, so first on the energy. I believe that we can stick together. The Germans have already almost filled their gas tanks, so they're prepared for the winter. The resolve is very strong. The European President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, recently said Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova will join the EU. Of course, there are problems with Hungary and other nations, but I believe the resolve will stay strong. The German people are now awake to this. I think this disinformation is actually more important than we realize. This is big geopolitics, because the German people can read the disinformation about the Russians being weaker, but there are other audiences, and I didn't mention Tehran. And right now, we are trying to negotiate a deal with the Iranians. The Iranians want sanctions taken off of them, that they're still sitting at the negotiating table with us, even though they're like one step away, 1 hour away from having a nuclear weapon. But they don't want that nuclear weapon, actually. They want sanctions removed more than they want that nuclear weapon. So, to my mind, that's an interesting card to play. If the Iranians start to think our Russian friends are weak, they can't help us in Syria, and by the way, if we get out of sanctions, we can sell our oil. I mean, that changes everything. So there's a lot of really interesting geopolitics at play. And of course, the resumed fighting, unfortunately, in Nagorno-Karabakh is another sign of that, with Azerbaijan and Armenia looking at the fact that Russia looked weak, and Russia has essentially been the neighbor that's kept more or less that war under control, if you will. So there are a lot of moving parts. With regard to your second question about the territory, look, the Ukrainian government has made it clear that they want every piece of their territory back. I think that getting Donbass back will be hard enough because the Russians are incredibly entrenched in there. Where we're talking about right now is territory that the Russians seized in this latest campaign from February onward. But if you go to the territory in Donbass where they've been entrenched since 2014, that's a harder proposition. And so it remains to be seen how the public in that territory responds. That will be part of it, because I'm sure the Ukrainians will try to use irregular warfare and all kinds of sabotage, things of that nature. But that will not be easy in and of itself. So we should not underestimate the difficulty the Ukrainians face in Donbass. Crimea is another proposition. There, to my mind, from what I know, it's also heavily fortified. They have nuclear-capable missiles there. It may be that somehow that's more vulnerable than Donbass in some ways, because it's possible that because the Russians can't access it as easily, the Ukrainians may have some advantage. But I think with regard to Crimea, that would be best. That wouldn't be my priority, I think, if I were the Ukrainian government, only because that can be negotiated later. The reality is that Crimea always had a kind of shared sovereignty. If there were a different government in Moscow, they could still share the sovereignty. So I think that, however, having said that, if there's an opportunity to take Crimea, of course the Ukrainians should take it. It's just that Donbass is going to be hard enough.
General.
Yeah. I think that many, and that as a minimum, and we have to be so careful, we, the West, the rest of the world, not to impose on Ukraine what we think their negotiating position should be. It's clear, the standing position is that they want to deoccupy all of Ukraine, at what it would have looked like in 2013. The reality may be somewhere in between, somewhere in the 2014 Minsk line, somewhere in the Donbass. But we need to make a point on Donbass and Crimea. I was there. Many of you were involved. These were illegally invaded. They were occupied, broke the UN Convention, the Budapest Memorandum, and so the Russians are there on wrong, illegal, aggressive pretext. The question is, what is there a line to negotiate? In my mind, if there's anything, it's that piece of the Donbass. Crimea should go back to Ukraine. But I also believe the Russians will fight hard and really hard for Crimea, and that could be, and most of the Russians, where they're ambivalent about Donbass, believe that Crimea in Russia is a righteous act. That's going to be if the Ukrainians could sweep in and take it, then do it. But I believe that if anything is a minimum, taken since 24 February, should be part of Ukraine even before any future negotiation, even if possible, though I know that will be very, very hard. One other thing, we're talking geostrategically. The China piece is huge.
Right.
And Xi Jinping was just in Samarkand, the Shanghai cooperation with Putin. Putin was kind of rebuffed. If there's anything that I will say from my mind with Xi Jinping and the Chinese, and it's interesting that Putin was in Beijing for the Olympics in February, as he was there in Sochi before 2014 and then before this invasion now. But if I'm Xi Jinping, I'm freaking furious at Putin. Yes, disruption and all that, but what Putin has done has been strategically challenging also for China, because again, he has coalesced a lot of the free-minded nations of the world, certainly on Russia, but that now includes also this concern about growing autocracies, the Russia-China thing, and I think it's made it all a whole lot more complicated for China.
And the economic component is what China's really worried about. I mean, they have seen declining growth, and they are concerned about that. Obviously, that's on Xi's radar every day. And he is concerned about this war continuing and the sanctions. And that's also why, of course, he hasn't come out firmly on Russia's side, because China doesn't want to be sanctioned by us and our allies.
I want to take 3 audience questions and combine them, which
only you can do.
One, are the Russians going to learn from this and fix their problems? Or 2, are we in danger of underestimating the Russian might in the future because of these failures they've had? And 3, how do we stop the cycle from going on? How, when this comes to a conclusion, what does the United States, the world need to do to make sure Russia does not do this in 5 years' time, 6 years' time, 2 years' time?
Well, if I could start very quickly, I think that's why I think it's urgent that we stop Russia now on the battlefield in Ukraine. Because right now, they don't have the forces, they don't have the will. The Ukrainians have the best chance at defeating them and pushing them out of Ukrainian territory. If we give them more capable weapons, the Ukrainians can do this. And if they don't do it, what we will end up with is some kind of ceasefire at best. And the ceasefire means that Vladimir Putin and his cronies come back to fight another day. And of course, then there's the chance that they could regroup. There is the off chance that he would call a full military mobilization. Right now, there's not the public support in Russia to do it. And in fact, it would probably could potentially mean the end of his regime, or at least him being in power personally, because the Russian people do not want to go to war with Ukraine, and he's largely isolated the Russian elites and the big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg from the war. He's taken from the poor eastern areas, Siberia, Dagestan, Chechnya, etc., to fight this war. But with increasing, troops going back, fleeing, and bringing the news home, right now is the moment for us to capitalize and to really address the challenge from Russia, because it's not going to go away if we don't stop Putin. He has a Hitler-esque mindset. Right now, he's still, it appears, delusional.
General.
Do you have one of your maps show the South?
The
occupation
second map.
of the
Let's
South?
throw up
I think
the
it's really
second map.
important. I worry, as I think many, as you do, is that the Russians press for humanitarian ceasefire negotiations. That encompasses especially the South, and then freeze it. And as Evelyn said, you now create, if you will, another long-term frozen conflict. The Russians regroup. No, they got to be out of there. And Ukrainians need to be given the wherewithal to get them out of there, especially if they want to get them out of there. I'm worried about the South, because that should all go back.
And that has to do, if I can interrupt you just
Please.
for a second, that has to do with the world economy, because
Right.
those ports are where the grain
That's right.
leaves from Ukraine to foreign countries like Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, other countries that are on the verge of starvation.
So operationally and strategically, while Kharkiv was extraordinary and Donbass is important, I believe the South and getting the South fixed, meaning the Russians out, is critical before any final negotiation. Now, the X factor is is Crimea part of that or not?
Right, but at least when we're talking about the land bridge between Crimea and the east, the nuclear power plant that supplies
all of it back.
this, and
Zaporizhzhia.
and how quickly does that need to happen? Is that something that needs to happen before the winter? Or have there been enough gains that if we had a wintertime pause, we could resume in the spring?
Military, momentum, and initiative. This is the time. They've got to push. Because again, defeat and bad news is infectious, is contagious. As you said, you don't want to give the Russians inside Ukraine a chance to get. They're on their back feet right now, and this thing will spread. We'll see what happens in Donbass, and it may create an effect. And they got to be careful that the Ukrainians can put pressure now on a demoralized Russian force that is now all throughout. Though I do worry that it'll be bloodier and all of that. No, this is the Ukrainians' time before winter.
We only have a minute left. A question we've gotten from the audience, which we've touched on a little bit, is the future of Vladimir Putin, his ability to hold on. Very quickly, 30 seconds each, what's your prediction? Will he maintain his hold on power? How far will he go to maintain his hold on power?
Well, I don't think any of us can really predict that, but if he calls for a full-scale mobilization, I don't think he'll maintain his hold on power, which is why he's probably going to try to play for time and pretend that all is well.
General.
I think he's in trouble. I think that he has doubled down. He's in a zero-sum situation. I know a number of Russian military. They're loyal, they're patriotic, don't like what they're doing, but they can't like what's been going on to their military. He's got that. He's got Gerasimov and Shoigu been in power for 10 years. You would think they would have been fired by now. I wonder if he's afraid of firing him because he's afraid of a reaction within the military. And so I think Putin is playing a balancing game. It's not going well. And as we saw in the last century, Russia, Soviet Union cracked not once, but viciously cracked twice. And so I think in the resilience, there's a lot of brittleness here, and I think Putin is on very, very dangerous ground.
Another sign, and I wish you guys would cover this a little more, all these killings, next story, all these killings of all the Lukoil executives, all the people who have spoken out. I mean, death by falling off balcony while smoking is like boring
accident.
now. There's like death by yachting and falling into the water. That's a little more exotic. There's death while suffocating just suddenly as you're going to lunch. You know, that tells me, though, the uptick, I mean, every day there's more and more of these. It's Putin killing people inside Russia who are criticizing the war effort and criticizing him.
And more people in Russia, both publicly, are increasingly emboldened to get out, and this could be the shove that puts that regime and Putin. He has nowhere to go, by the way.
And I would say one quick thing just to tie this together, because this is where, well, we can't see them because of the lights. To tie this together is really that the, now I'm going to lose my train of thought. Well, to tie it together, okay, I lost my train of thought.
That's all right, because we have gone over.
Take care.
So, thank you to our panelists for the discussion, and thank you, the audience, for these great questions, and we'll see you next year.
Okay, to
I
tie
have
it
to
together,
say hello to my own
watch
boss.
the military. Watch the military.
Oh, how are you?
Peter, Evelyn, Julian, amazing. I mean, we could, don't leave. We want to get a quick picture if you don't mind. You could continue to talk all day, and we could continue to ask questions all day. Please, a round of applause. Just terrific.
I'm still noisy, I'm sorry.